I want to talk to you about competing responsibly. We're returning to the theme of corporate social responsibility and thinking about what it takes for a corporation to actually behave responsibly, how it can compete in the marketplace and compete effectively while also doing so responsibly. It's not an entirely simple question. For one thing, we've talked about ethical, legal, and economic constraints on a company. Companies have many different responsibilities and to many different groups. So it's a difficult balancing act. And companies ideally would like to contribute to the community, do things that are positive, and be good corporate citizens, while at the same time actually making money. I want to talk about an aspect of this that's often ignored: the extent to which the competitive circumstances of a company affect the extent and nature of its responsibilities, as well as the effectiveness of various strategies in meeting them. A company does have a responsibility, not only to its shareholders, but to its customers, to its employees, and others, to actually make money and stay in business. Survivability is crucial for companies, and it's really an ethical responsibility as well as an economic responsibility. Once we recognize that, we see that it's not enough to say, well, sometimes ethics just takes precedence over economics. Ideally, we want to be ethical and be effective economically at the same time. We want to fulfill our responsibilities and actually add to the survivability of the corporation, what Taleb refers to as its anti-fragility, at the same time that we actually contribute to the community. So being a good corporation, and in the sense of a good money-making corporation, and being a good corporate citizen, ideally we'd like to find ways of combining those. But the ways in which that can be done really depend a great deal on the nature of that particular industry and the degree of competition within the industry. Bert Vandeven and Ronald Jurison put it this way: when we define the responsibilities of a firm in stakeholder terms, we should realize that the firm itself is a nexus of stakeholders. A firm is a cooperative venture for mutual benefit, a coalition of participants, clients, employees, share owners, suppliers, who are all economic stakeholders of each other, and who all depend on the continuity of the firm for their wealth and well-being. Hence, the ability of a firm to survive is an important instrumental moral good in view of the legitimate interests and rights of many stakeholders. It's obvious that the survivability of the firm is in the owner's interest, at least ordinarily. There may be times when the business is failing and it's better to liquidate. But putting those aside, yes, of course, the managerial theory will say there is such a responsibility. But I think it's important that they point out that that's true in the stakeholder theory too. The business has a responsibility not only to its owners, but to its employees, its customers, its suppliers, its creditors, and so on, to survive, to continue in business. And that's going to require making money. How on earth do you pay your employees? How do you pay your suppliers? You've got to be able to make money to do it. And how do you justify all the effort, all the risk-taking and so on for the owners? Well, you have to contribute to a return for them too. So in order to survive, a business has to make money. And that's an important ethical obligation as well as an important economic responsibility. But now, how can firms actually do this? After all, there are times when contributing to the good of the community may cost the firms real money, and may cost not only in the obvious sense, but impose a net cost. So the question that they face is this: how can firms compete in a morally acceptable way, given the fact that they have to survive in an environment where competition is more or less intense, more or less regulated, and more or less susceptible to the scrutiny of influential stakeholders? The managerial theory, as Friedman presents it, tends to assume a world of perfect competition. And indeed, in a world of perfect competition, corporate social responsibility, in the sense of fulfilling imperfect obligations that impose a net cost on the company, that really is something that could not exist. Why? Because if you start being a good corporate citizen and start spending money in order to contribute to the community, but it is a net cost on your business, someone else can come in who does not do that, and they can undercut you on prices, or they can pay their workers more. They can, in short, gain a competitive advantage over you and put you out of business. So in a perfectly competitive market, corporate social responsibility, in the sense in which it's controversial, that is to say, fulfilling these charitable, imperfect obligations or responsibilities that impose a net cost on the company, that's something that you would not see engaged in at all, really, unless, of course, it were legally required. But we're assuming that there's no legal requirement. It doesn't make economic sense to do it. In fact, it's a net cost. It makes economic sense not to do it. And so those things you would expect to disappear in a perfectly competitive market. But of course, the actual markets in various places are not perfectly competitive. Now, their approximation to that varies a huge amount from industry to industry. And so the ethical responsibilities of various companies are going to depend on the extent to which competition in their industry approximates a perfectly competitive market. If it does so to a great extent, you would expect corporate social responsibility to be a serious threat to the survivability of the company. If, on the other hand, it's a relatively uncompetitive market, and there are many such, well, then you might think that the company can afford a greater degree of charitable activity even when it imposes a net cost on the company. What determines the degree of competition within an industry? Well, we have to take into account a variety of competitive forces. One of them is simply the possibility of entry of new competitors. Can someone easily enter the business and start undercutting you? If entry is easy, well, it's going to be a more competitive marketplace, a more competitive industry. If there are significant barriers to entry, it'll be difficult. Second factor is the threat of substitutes. How substitutable are things within this market? Sometimes there's a market where things are highly substitutable. You are, let's say, producing bottled mineral water. Well, there are many different brands, and people may say, well, I like that brand a bit, but in the end, gosh, it's mineral water. Or maybe you are producing gasoline for automobiles. Well, you might say, maybe I prefer this brand of gas or that brand of gas, but really, it's more or less the same thing, and so on. In other cases, it's not at all the same thing. There's a big difference between an Apple computer, for example, and a Hewlett-Packard, or various other PCs. And so there are times when brand image is significant and things are not easily substitutable. So that's going to matter to the degree of competitiveness within the industry. A third factor is the bargaining power of buyers. How much bargaining power do they have? Well, sometimes not very much. They need the product. They really aren't going to bargain over it. And so, they don't have much power at all. It's up to the company to set prices and so forth. And in other cases, actually, it's competitive enough that there's a significant amount of bargaining power on the part of the buyers, on the part of the customers. Of course, the same thing is true of suppliers. Sometimes the suppliers are in a position to exert great bargaining power. Other times, it's easy to substitute one supplier for another, and so they have very little bargaining power. The last factor is just the extent of rivalry among the existing competitors. Sometimes there are many different competitors, and they are working hard to try to keep their share of the business and increase their share and take part of the business for themselves. In other cases, there are relatively few companies in the marketplace, and they may not be very aggressive in trying to compete with one another. All of those factors determine the degree of competition within a given industry, and they're going to matter a lot for the extent of corporate responsibilities, also for strategies for meeting those responsibilities. Well, what can companies do to compete? There are many things, of course, but typically they fall under three broad headings. One of them is cost leadership. Here's how I can compete. I can lower my prices. There are many of us in town who are selling fast food hamburgers. Yeah, there are some differences, and some people prefer this brand, some people prefer that, but actually they're kind of similar. How am I going to compete? I'm going to try to be the low-price burger. I remember a place when I was a child, 19-cent burgers. It was amazing. But that was a different time. 19-cent burgers, 19 cents for a gallon of gasoline. There was a place that had a wonderful steak sandwich for 49 cents. Yeah, that time is gone, sadly. However, there are other times when, look, you can't compete much on price because people care a lot about the brand and they're willing to pay extra for a certain thing. So the degree is going to vary with the industry, but in general, trying to compete on price is one main competitive strategy. A second is to develop a brand image. That is to say, to make your brand distinctive, to differentiate it from other brands. In some industries, that's going to be a hard strategy to pursue. It's all pretty much the same thing. But in other cases, you can try to really develop your brand, make sure people want that particular kind because it's different in some way. A popular marketing book is called Differentiate or Die. And that is an important point, not just in marketing, but in general in strategic thinking. What makes my product different? I'm not going to be able to charge people more and attract them away from other products unless there's something unique, something special, something different about mine. And the last thing is focus. Different companies are going to have different focuses. So one company may focus on young people, for example, and try to tailor their products to a younger demographic. Others may tailor their business mostly for businesses. Someone else may look mostly at more mature adults, and so forth. You can think about this with television stations. They have very different target audiences in mind. And that's going to matter a lot, their competitive strategy. They aren't all competing for the same viewers. Some of them are competing for younger viewers, some of them older viewers, some of them mostly male viewers, some mostly female viewers, and so on. And so that's a way of trying to compete as well. Find a niche in the marketplace and find a particular target audience that you serve especially well. Specific strategies for meeting corporate social responsibilities are going to arise and are going to be most effective in different competitive environments. So let's distinguish 3 degrees of competition. Obviously, there's a continuum here, but nevertheless, let's talk about 3 broad categories. There are conditions in an industry of fierce competition. In fierce competition, there are going to be a lot of competitors, a lot of rivalry among competitors, pretty low barriers to entry so new competitors can enter the market. It's going to be very hard to differentiate products. It's going to be hard to compete on anything but price. This kind of industry is going to most closely approximate a perfectly competitive environment, where indeed it will be very hard to impose any net cost on the business that is dedicated to charitable activities, to being a good corporate citizen. You are working as hard as you can to lower costs as much as you can. And at that rate, to consider significant expenditures for the sake of being a good corporate citizen is going to look pretty impossible and irresponsible indeed, unless there is some real benefit to your bottom line to doing so. Well, if that's your situation, what can you do? In such a situation, you're basically forced to adopt a low-cost strategy. And that's going to mean you can't really afford much in the way of activities for corporate social responsibility. Nevertheless, there might be some things you can do. For example, you can pursue a displacement strategy. Any expenditure that you undertake that your competitors are not is going to be something that places you at a competitive disadvantage. So you can, if you think that it will really help the community, seek some industry-wide activities, the costs of which will be borne by all the competitors. One way to do that is to seek regulation or to seek legislation that will actually force everyone to engage in certain kinds of activities. But another way is simply to establish professional or industry-wide codes of conduct. It may happen that everyone within an industry is basically within what in game theory is called a prisoner's dilemma, and that means that each pursuing their own self-interest is actually harming not only the community, but harming one another. And so in situations like that, it may well be that the best thing to do is to have the group agree on industry-wide standards. Now, we've got to be careful here. That can start looking like collusion and like something that is fundamentally an anti-competitive strategy. But the idea here would be that sometimes it's not really that. Sometimes it is activity that would be for the good of the community at large. Think back in the 1930s, 1940s about codes governing movies. Hollywood had a code that filmmakers followed about what could be shown in movies, what couldn't, what kind of language could be used, what couldn't, and so forth. And the idea was supposed to be that, look, you could gain a competitive advantage if you broke the code in some way, but nevertheless it would be bad for the community if people did that, and so they all agreed to abide by that code. It wasn't forced on them through legislation, and it wasn't something that each individual studio decided to do on its own for the sake of the larger culture. It's something that they all got together and did. And so that is something that DeGeorge refers to as ethical displacement, saying, well, let's not think of it as my responsibility, let's think of it as our responsibility, and try to address the ethical issue at a different level, here an industry-wide level, maybe even a governmental level, when the industry-wide level doesn't work out. Of course, even within a fiercely competitive marketplace, people are going to have an obligation to obey the law. They're going to have an obligation to fulfill economic responsibilities, and so they will want to engage in charitable activities that will actually produce an economic benefit to the firm. And sometimes it might well do that. In a town where there's fierce competition among pizza parlors, it may be that sponsoring the local Little League team is something that will bring a lot of goodwill and encourage people to come to your pizza parlor. And so, even in a fiercely competitive industry, sometimes you can gain a brand advantage by engaging in such activities. You can improve customer loyalty by doing that. Other marketplaces are characterized by what we might call strong competition. In strong competition, we've got not exactly that close an approximation to a perfectly competitive marketplace, but still we have many competitors competing very seriously for one another's business. It's not that hard to enter, though it's not trivial to enter the business. Suppliers, customers have some serious bargaining power, and so on. And so there's a great deal of competition. Here, brand differentiation becomes a key competitive strategy. What's going to make you buy my computer as opposed to somebody else's computer? I've got to differentiate my brand. I might decide simply to be a low-cost producer, but I may want to say, no, I'm the one that has this different operating system. I'm the one who's more stylish. I'm the one who has more power for gamers as well as serious business applications. I am the low-cost producer, and so on. So you might want to differentiate your brand according to those various kinds of considerations. How does this affect strategies for corporate social responsibility? Well, it enables you to pursue some other than the ones available in a fiercely competitive situation. You can, for example, think about complying not only with the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law, making it clear that you are the company that doesn't just do what you're formally required to do, but you understand the intention behind the laws and you are trying to live up to that spirit. You may also seek brand differentiation through ethical activities. You may say it adds to my brand, it adds to my differentiation. If I am the one that stands up against slave labor in other countries, for example, the one that stands up for fair trade practices, that does this or that other thing for the sake of the community. You may engage in stakeholder management. Make it clear that you are committed not only to the good of your owners, your shareholders, but also to the good of your employees, the good of your customer, the good of your suppliers, the good of your local community, that you are a company that cares about people. And finally, you may well pursue a way of managing your brand that involves ethical reporting that makes clear and explicit your public commitment to behaving ethically. All of those are available to you in a strongly competitive marketplace, but probably not in a really fiercely competitive one, where you simply can't differentiate your product to a very great extent. You can't build much brand loyalty, and you've got to compete on price, being able to afford very little beyond simply trying to provide the product reliably at a low price. Finally, some firms find themselves in a weakly competitive environment. There may be significant barriers to entry, not very many competitors. These are markets that tend toward an oligarchy, or maybe even a monopoly, a situation where a few firms, or maybe even one firm, is really in control. Think about social media. Twitter, Facebook, Google, and so on dominate huge portions of their marketplaces. They are in a weakly competitive environment. Now, there are competitors, DuckDuckGo, for example, for Google, and MeWe for Facebook and so on, but they have a tiny fraction of the business. The vast majority goes to the companies I've named. Well, in those cases, you could say, look, there's very weak competition. These are companies that actually can afford considerable expenditures, even when they impose a net cost on the business, for the sake of corporate social responsibility. Now, sometimes, of course, that responsibility might be exercised well and ethically. Sometimes it may simply indulge people in various ways. That's one of Milton Friedman's concerns about corporate social responsibility. But however you think about that question, these are situations where a company can go far beyond the strategies available in a fiercely competitive or even a strongly competitive environment. One thing that typically applies at all of these levels, in all kinds of degrees of competitiveness, is the obligation to obey the law. But we have to be careful about that, because the law can actually come into conflict with ethics in various ways. A given law may be unjust, for example. It may be that the law is simply foolish. Its costs far outweigh its benefits. Look, I teach at a large institution where it becomes obvious that some rules are really counterproductive. They're foolish rules. And so your ethical obligation to your students, for example, may require you to break certain rules simply because the rules make no sense. Well, the older you get and the more you are in big bureaucratic enterprises, the more you'll encounter rules like that, and the law can be like that too. At times the law requires things that just don't make any sense and in fact prevent you from fulfilling real ethical responsibilities. And so those can be times too where the law is not unjust, it's just dumb. It's just counterproductive. And there may actually, in such cases, be an ethical obligation to violate the law. There can be other kinds of problems. It might be that many people in the industry are actually violating a certain law. Maybe it's in fact enforced very sporadically, so that it seems arbitrary and highly damaging to the person who gets caught, but nevertheless, you're unlikely to get caught. And so the person who, obeys the law is actually at a huge competitive disadvantage. In such circumstances, you might expect that companies are going to ignore the law, and you might even excuse that behavior. You might say, look, the fact is, if you comply with the law when nobody else is, you're putting yourself in danger. Think about, actually, an example here. I don't know if it's still this way, but it used to be this way. Interstate 95 between Richmond and Washington, D.C. was a road that used to have a 55-mile-an-hour speed limit. But in fact, everyone went 75 or 80. If you actually tried to comply with the speed limit on that road, you were a danger to yourself and others. And so that's a situation a company might find itself in too. Look, this is a law that's doesn't seem to be enforced really. Nobody else is obeying it. If I obey it, I'm not only placing myself at a huge disadvantage, I'm endangering my customers, I'm endangering my employees, my suppliers, my creditors, and so forth. And, of course, I'm endangering myself. Maybe I'm even endangering others because I'm at risk of upsetting the apple cart, as it were, and alerting people to the fact that, wait, most companies aren't doing this. In general, it is a highly dangerous situation when you have laws on the books that are only sporadically and rarely enforced. It's going to look arbitrary when they are enforced. And so it is a bad situation from a social point of view and from an ethical point of view. There's another situation where ethical responsibilities may conflict with the law. Sometimes the law has been passed to benefit a certain interest group, and it actually places a firm at a huge competitive disadvantage. Maybe a cartel of competitors got together and managed to change the law in a way that places your company at a disadvantage. This often happens with regulatory bodies. In fact, it's known as the problem of regulatory capture. The big players in an industry that's being regulated often can play a very large role in shaping the regulations. And they do it not always for the public good, in fact, often not for the public good, but to place their competitors at a disadvantage. They can afford the costs of meeting the regulation, but to enter the business, or for their smaller competitors, those costs are very considerable. And so they may do it in a way that is intended to not promote the social good, but instead harm their competitors. Are you under an ethical obligation to obey a law like that, a law that was designed not for the public good, but precisely to put you at a disadvantage? Arguably not. At least there can be a kind of ethical dilemma in facing a situation where the law has been created precisely to disadvantage you. I want to close by considering three important ethical points that Van de Ven and Jurissen make. And so let me quote them, because I think these are critical points to keep in mind when we contemplate not only the extent of responsibilities to the larger community, but also ways in which businesses can responsibly go about meeting those responsibilities. The first point, the continuation of a firm has an instrumental moral value, because normally all stakeholders have a legitimate stake in this continuation. The reasons for prioritizing a firm's survival are moral reasons. In other words, the economic considerations are not really distinct from the moral considerations. They're not even completely independent from them. They overlap them to a very large extent. In fact, arguably, the economic considerations are themselves moral considerations. Secondly, every functioning system has to reproduce itself in order to be able to comply with whatever duty is imposed on it. Kant famously said, ought implies can. Doesn't make any sense to have an obligation you can't possibly fulfill. They say, ought implies be. I can't very well have a responsibility if I don't even exist to meet it. And so the very first thing I have to be concerned about as a business is my own survivability. I can't fulfill any obligations to anyone if I don't even exist. And the last important ethical point, the stakes of all stakeholders do not override fundamental rights to liberty, life, and property. We have to keep in mind the distinction we drew earlier between kinds of obligation, between, in the ethical sphere, the things that were involved with the violations of, or the protection of, the respect for, rights, and then a broader set of ethical considerations. No matter how serious the ones at that outer level are, they cannot justify the violation of rights. And so if people have rights to life, liberty, and property, those are things that cannot be overridden by charitable concerns, or by concerns that, well, the company will make more profit and so be more survivable if we violate these people's rights, or if we engage in slave labor in this other country, etc., etc. Those things are ruled out completely. And so, although we have a serious moral responsibility as a firm to promote our own health, our own vitality, our own survivability, we have obligations to respect people's rights to life, liberty, and property that cannot be overridden by our own selfish concerns, even if those have a serious moral status.